Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, some people might be wondering just how safe is their baby food. Many Americans spend a lot of money feeding their babies food out of the jars. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And there is a new COVID epicenter in the United States, and it is not New York or New Jersey. And we're going to talk a little bit about the United States and Russia continuing with their tit for tat. Well, first we're going to talk about arsenic, lead, and mercury are going to be limited now in, of all things, baby food. The FDA plans to propose limits on those toxic substances after a congressional report that found baby foods are tainted with heavy metals. Well, currently, the United States government doesn't regulate heavy metals in baby foods, but well, that's about to change. And of course, Jeff, scientific reports show that excess heavy metals can affect the child's brain functions over time, leading to developmental delays, among other neurological problems. And it's not regulated, hasn't been regulated for a long time, that these substances are allowed in baby food.
Right. Surprising that they even allow any in the baby food. Yeah. You know, now they're going to regulate it.
Sure.
Well, Brazil's ongoing COVID battle, along with its very own variant, could affect us here in the U.S. Now, Brazil's health ministry said that some hospitals could run out of medicine to treat COVID-19 patients within 10 days. Now, this on the heels of a reported 3,500 COVID-related deaths in the last 24 hours. Now, one mother and wife, Savannah Cerivas, mourned the loss of her 33-year-old son and husband, who both died just 4 days apart. Now, she said in an interview with CBS Evening News, "My heart wails and the tears fall. I don't have words to describe the suffering." She also asked aloud, why the both of them?
Yeah, traumatic loss there. Well, despite the hardships on Brazil due to the pandemic, two of the largest cities, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, have recently started to loosen restrictions on bars and restaurants, while the country has currently only vaccinated 3% of its population.
Well, now on the U.S.'s effort to slow the pandemic, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine was hailed as a great asset in the fight against COVID, as it was cheaper, easier to store, and of course only required the one shot. But now federal authorities are recommending healthcare providers to hold off on using it. Officials expect the hold to last for just days, and the president's administration says that it won't affect the goal on how many shots are administered.
Well, what the U.S. government discovered about the vaccine while its administration is on hold will have a large impact on the rest of the world, as of course many countries are depending on Johnson & Johnson vaccine to get them past the pandemic. Well, heeding the government's request, 50 states have agreed to halt the J&J vaccine, but over 7.2 million of the Johnson & Johnson shots have already been administered, and 6 of those people who were administered the shots have developed blood clots. The CDC and FDA says the condition appears to be extremely rare.
Although the number of those who develop blood clots is small compared to the amount of shots already administered, authorities say that the move is done out of concern and caution, but is not expected to last long. Now, the worry is that people will be more hesitant to receive the Johnson & Johnson shot. Well, the FDA and the CDC are investigating those 6 cases. Now, vaccine sites across the U.S. had to cancel and readjust the type of vaccine administered as they switch from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to other manufacturers.
Now, the government expressed the clots as a rare disorder, while governors of several states downplayed the issue. In fact, Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire said the ability for governors to reinstill confidence after something like this is 100 times harder than putting the pause in the first place.
Right. Well, Kent Koster, the Purchasing District Health Department Public Health Director, said to CBS this morning, "It is frustrating for the providers because we're there. We're ready to give the vaccine," he said, "but the people just aren't coming in." Well, the White House insists that the pace of the vaccines will not change much, as about 95% of the vaccine supply has come from Pfizer and Moderna. Now, President Biden said there's enough vaccine that is basically 100% acceptable for every single American.
Recent recipients of the Johnson & Johnson shot should look out for the following symptoms, including severe headache, chest discomfort, and difficulty breathing. Well, that according to Dr. Anthony Fauci in an interview with CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell. He also said the symptoms typically present themselves about 6 to 13 days after receiving the shot. So if you're beyond the 4 weeks or 1 to 2 months ago you received your shots, he said, I don't think you have anything that you need to worry about.
Well, Monica Roberts Jenkins falls into that category. The Houston paralegal said that she would get the shot again, as there are side effects with anything, she said, whether it's surgeries, medicines, or whatever. Now, that's just her thought on it, but a lot of people are concerned with those side effects, and they'd rather stay away from it.
Blood clots can become life-threatening if they're not treated, and depending on where the clot occurs as well. Well, new infections skyrocket in Michigan, along with 4 other states whose COVID-19 numbers are spiking. There are nearly as many new cases now as there were during the worst part of the pandemic, with new cases being the highest per capita, 72% higher than the second largest state in cases, which is New Jersey. And its positivity rate is nearly 3 times more than the national average. Nearly 24 hospitals in the state of Michigan are at least 90% full.
Well, Dr. Jha said that the situation in Michigan is pretty bad. It's as bad as it was over the holidays. Now, the variants are one of the drivers of it. Now, the governor of Michigan is begging the Biden administration for help, asking for more vaccines brought into the state. Now, the CDC director said the answer is not necessarily to give vaccines. She said the answer to that is to go back to where we were last spring and summer, to shut things down. So once again, she said the answer is not necessarily to give a vaccine, but rather shut things down. Now, Michigan's governor is extending restrictions that will allow people to continue to work from home, but puts a 2-week pause on indoor dining, in-person classes, and youth sports.
In Michigan, high school age children are more likely to be infected than any other group. More than 1 in 4 test positive of those children. And of course, the UK variant is dominating all 50 states. A new study has revealed that the UK strain is 35% more transmissible, but not more severe or deadly than the original COVID strain. Michigan student athletes are now tested every week, with athletes saying it's more of a burden on them. And of course, the governor of Michigan also said what's happening in Michigan could also happen in other states as well.
Well, we talked a little bit about that surge in Brazil. They're seeing now 3,500. They had 3,500 deaths in one day. Reporting, our field correspondent Larry McGee is covering the latest from Brazil and this COVID surge, along with a couple other stories, including more on the Johnson & Johnson one-shot and how they're going to pause with that vaccine until they can get things worked out. But Larry, your first article on Brazil, what is the COVID surge that they're dealing with at this time?
All trustworthy experts have predicted that there will be no letting up with regard to the current plague. And true to their assertions, well over a year later, the virus is still present and worsening in its impact every day. Brazil is now making headlines for its infection rates and numbers of those wilting under the burden of COVID due to co-infections. Brazilians lack words to describe their anguish as they lose family members one after the other. Despite that fact, however, the country's authorities are set to loosen restrictions in two of its largest cities. There was large-scale hype associated with Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, but that is now beginning to fracture into disillusionment as reports begin to roll in, revealing side effects associated with the shot. The governments of all 50 states have instituted a halt with regard to administering the virus, while at the same time attempting to do damage control and keep citizens on board with the idea of hope and salvation through vaccination. But behind the scenes, governors are said to be lodging complaints with the White House concerning the fiasco. Nations around the world who are accustomed to following America's lead in times of global crisis are said to be paying close attention. Officials say the pause should only be a matter of days for those interested in purchasing and employing Johnson & Johnson's one-shot concoction. There were shots fired in Syria yet again as multiple missiles were reported to have been launched from an aircraft at different installations in the country believed to belong to the military. Other targets allegedly belonging to Hezbollah were also struck. In all, the incident is reported to have left 4 men dead. Israel's military is said to stop just short of acknowledging responsibility for the attack. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. The time, Jeff. Back to you.
Well, whether it's, the attack on the weapon caches in Iran or what we see taking place with the spike in COVID-related deaths in Brazil, and then you add that Johnson & Johnson, there's a lot of unrest all throughout the world, a lot of uncertainty causing a lot of stress to not only the United States, but people all over the world. Well, in response to the recent expulsion of Russian diplomats by the United States, Russia has likewise made the decision to ask 10 U.S. diplomats to leave their country. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also says the Kremlin will sanction 8 U.S. administration officials whose names have yet to be announced. That is in retaliation for the sanctions placed on Russian government officials.
Well, President Joe Biden had announced the expulsions and sanctions on Russians on Thursday because of election meddling and cyber attacks. While the Kremlin is not taking this lightly, Russia says it is also looking at how it can put pressure on the U.S. business sector as well.
Mr. Lavrov says all U.S. foundations and NGOs will be closed as well due to their interference in Russian affairs. No names have been released for these organizations yet. The measures also include not hiring any more U.S. citizens to work in their missions in the United States. They say they will only hire Russians. These decisions could affect a lot of different U.S. workers in Russia, from drivers and housekeepers to analysts and other individuals already working in Russia's U.S. diplomatic missions.
Of course, that's making life very difficult for those Americans, but Russia isn't even stopping there. Now, the foreign minister threatened to ask the U.S. to remove 150 of its U.S. workers out of Russian missions if the U.S. continues to add additional sanctions on Russia. Now, this is because 150 out of those 450 Russians who work in Russian missions in the U.S. work in the UN, but the U.S. has 450 Americans working in the U.S. missions in Russia, plus additional staff working at the United Nations.
Finally, Mr. Lavrov is making the suggestion that U.S. ambassadors to Russia, John Sullivan, should head back to the United States to seek consultation with his superiors over the current situation. The foreign minister also explains that their own ambassador is stationed in Washington, D.C., who was stationed in Washington, D.C., is back in Russia at this time as well.
Well, so the sanctions and expulsions aren't the only problems arising between Russia and the U.S. and its allies these days. Head of NATO Jens Stoltenberg recently said Russia must end this military buildup in and around Ukraine, stop its provocations, and de-escalate immediately. Now, Russia recently deployed Navy ships, heavy armor, and tens of thousands of troops as violence has risen between Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian-backed forces in Ukraine's east. However, Stoltenberg called the buildup unjustified and unexplained.
Yeah, well, NATO's definitely pushing back at Russia as they're kind of building up their defenses along its border, but Russia was also concerned about NATO building up, troops and stations around Russia's border. So we see that push and pull taking place from both NATO and Russia.
Right, and remember, they're both engaging in their so-called military exercises or drills, but really right in each other's back doors.
That's right. Well, after meeting with NATO's Secretary General, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, remarked, "By gathering today, we try to avoid the mistake that was made in 2014, when Russia was ready to act swiftly and pursue its main military goals in Crimea and Donbass, while our Western partners were considering their reactions to what was happening on the ground. Well, Russia will not be able to catch anyone by surprise anymore," he said. He also urged NATO to respond to this, quote, threat of war, what they see taking place with Russia.
Well, Mr. Kuleba also met with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on his 3-day visit to Brussels. Secretary Blinken said, "We're seeing, unfortunately, Russia take very provocative action when it comes to Ukraine. We're now seeing the largest concentration of forces on Ukraine's border since 2014. Now, as a result of their meeting, the U.S. agreed to station an extra 500 troops in Germany."
Well, Kiev is pushing NATO to become a member of the alliance. Its president believes that if it can be accomplished, it could help in the conflict with Russia by sending Moscow a loud message that Ukraine is a sovereign nation that won't stand to be bullied.
While the Kremlin officials explained the extra troops sent to the region are carrying out training exercises, and they feel Ukraine's actions have been provocative. Now, some analysts think President Putin isn't too concerned about war with Ukraine as he is in challenging the United States government.
Well, one former NATO official, Fabrice Pothier, explained to Al Jazeera News in a recent interview, he said, quote, "What we have seen over the last few months is a breakdown of the Russia-U.S. relations since the Biden administration took power, and I think Putin is basically replying to that, and he's testing the Biden administration to see how far they're willing to go or how tough they really are going to be, that is, on Russia," end quote.
Well, while much of the world is consumed by the pandemic and the cost of everything from toilet paper to construction materials going up, the tensions mounting in Europe are real and the worst they have been in years. Now, should Americans be concerned with the potential for a real war breaking out between Ukraine and Russia? Well, the question remains, how far is the U.S. willing to go? And do American politicians want to see the conflict between Ukraine and Russia turn into a war which the U.S. involves itself in?
Fox News' Tucker Carlson interviewed former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Gabbard is an outspoken Democrat from the state of Hawaii who told Carlson the situation is very dangerous and said, "We need to understand that such a war would come at a cost beyond anything that we can really imagine. This is not a war that's going to be happening to someone else, somewhere else on the other side of the world. No, this is something that will directly impact me and you, Tucker, every single one of your viewers and all of our loved ones."
Well, Ms. Gabbard took it further, saying, "This is a war that is not a game. It's a war in which there are no winners because you've got thousands of nuclear weapons that the United States has aimed at Russia. Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at us that could hit any town or city in America in less than 30 minutes. And just to pause there, that's not the first time that timeline has been shown to us, that some high-ranking officials say, yes, anywhere from 30 minutes to 1 hour, and the world could be wiped out by these nuclear weapons. So continuing, she said, and the cost and exact a cost on every one of us that will result in excruciating death and suffering beyond comprehension. Now, hundreds of millions of people dying and suffering, seeing their flesh being burned from their bones. This is something that you can't really even imagine, and it's a cost that we will all pay. Pretty powerful statements.
Yeah, that's right. Well, when asked why the United States would ever consider going to war with Russia, a viable option, Ms. Gabbard answered, "It is one that we should not do for those very reasons." If you look at the impacts of what a nuclear war brings, it really brings about the end of the world as we know it. And our leaders should understand this consequence and take it seriously. Well, she encouraged President Biden to de-escalate the tensions quickly and quickly end the new Cold War that has been taking place.
Well, Ms. Gabbard added, if he doesn't, then it's not a question of if we go to war with Russia, if this war ends up with a nuclear holocaust, it really is just a question of when. And if we continue down this path that we are on, it's something that could happen a lot sooner than any of us think. You know, in those words that she said, you know, especially the, you know, that this would not, there are no winners in a nuclear war. That is something that all leaders have to understand. There are no winners in a nuclear war, and that it would bring about the end of the world as we know it, end of civilization, because there would be very, very few survivors in an all-out nuclear war between these superpowers, Russia and the U.S. You add China and even some of these smaller ones in there, and that would be pretty much complete destruction.
Right, and she gave some pretty graphic details about, you know, the results of someone pretty close enough to a nuclear explosion, you know, their flesh, you know, kind of melting away off of their bones. And that's just the initial consequence of an explosion. You have the lasting effects of radiation sickness that takes place as well, along with the contamination of the land. So like you just mentioned, it's not like you're going to be on top of the world if you're still alive after an exchange of nuclear arsenal between several countries, because everything is going to be destroyed.
Right, and you know, there will be pockets of survivors here and there, even with the majority that would be, you know, either burned up in those initial blasts, but like you said, the radiation poisoning, it would start a chain reaction that mankind would not be able to recover from unless someone step in and stop it.
That's right.
And if you'd like to find out more about these stories, contact the House of Yahweh. When you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. You can email the House of Yahweh at info@Yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen. And don't forget the Yisrael Says and Ask Yisrael programs, free and available online to aid you in your studies. You can find those by going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Well, we know the thought of all-out nuclear war is a pretty fearful thing to consider, but there is something that you and your family can do to stay safe, and you can start by watching Yisrael Hawkins and listening to his message up next. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.